as capitalism produces wealth. The history of my profession, economics, has been overwhelming to celebrate one half of the dialectical unity, the production of wealth, and to occlude from the popular consciousness an awareness that right woven into the production of wealth is the production and reproduction of poverty. Said simply, my conclusion, to seriously overcome poverty forces you to confront the capitalism that reproduces it. The goal of getting rid of poverty without confronting and transforming capitalism has been a mirage that has distracted all kinds of really good people for an awfully long time, and my fervent hope is that you do not join their ranks. That's enough. Thanks.
It is a real privilege to follow Professor Wolff, whom I've not heard in person before, since he has spoken so eloquently by way of presenting a systemic critique and a structural critique. I'm not going to focus my remarks on that, much as I may agree with parts, even considerable parts of his presentation. I'd like to speak more directly to the concerns of Amnesty International and the concerns that many of you here might have in linking the themes of human rights and poverty. I would like to say a few words about the relevance of a rights-based point of view to understanding poverty, and the relevance of an understanding of poverty to a rights-based point of view. I think Professor Wolff is entirely right that economists have by and large not been interested in a number of the questions which one would think that they would be and should be interested in, and which have probably motivated many of you to be members of this organization or to be present here. In particular, I think it's fair to say that a concern for poverty has always been a relative sidelight of the discipline, not a central focus, as Professor Wolff has said. I think it's also true that a concern for rights has not figured very prominently in the discipline, to say the least. Jeremy Bentham, the founder of 19th century utilitarianism, famously said that rights were nonsense, and natural rights were nonsense on stilts. And that, I think, fairly well summarizes the attitude of most economists to rights, with some exceptions, and even some improbable exceptions. For example, Austrian economists, some of them, not all of them, some of them, have taken rights quite seriously as an independent concern. Here I mean Austrian, of course, not in the geographical sense of people from Austria necessarily, but those who subscribe to the so-called Austrian School of Economics. But they've also had a rather partial and limited understanding of what the relevant rights were, focusing on property rights in particular, the rights of the haves to possess property and to use that property in particular ways. And of course, some of them, for example, Hayek, made a link between such property rights and broader understandings of rights, which they believed to be connected. But by and large, I think mainstream economists, certainly in the United States, which has been the headquarters of mainstream economics, and by far the most powerful, source of by far the most prominent and powerful intellectual influences on the subject, basically ignored the concept of rights. Even when it appears in such obscure, peripheral areas of the discipline as social choice theory, it's usually in a rather limited sort of a way. Recently, in the last 10 years or so, there has come to be some interest in the question of the relationship between economics and human rights, and a minor sub-discipline has emerged around that, asking the question of how rights concerns can be taken into economics more centrally. Now, one point of view on this might be that the concern for rights consists of a set of moralistic pieties which don't help to address the underlying structural concerns which one ought to have. I don't think that's true, and one reason I don't think that's true is that I think that having a concern with rights does help one to avoid certain kinds of bad arguments which are not appropriately focused on the underlying human concerns that ought to motivate us. I also think that having a concern for rights helps to guard against certain kinds of, let's say, excessive aggregation, both across people and across time, in which we argue that, to put it a little bit crudely as it's sometimes done, it's necessary to break a few eggs in order to make an omelette, and that it's perfectly adequate to ride roughshod over the concerns of a certain group of people in order to achieve some larger economic or social goal, a developmental goal, for instance. And rights concerns lead us away from this, so that those who propose, for example, building a large dam, which will displace quite a number of people, and thereby deprive them of their livelihoods, are cautioned by rights discourse that there is something wrong here, there is something that's of concern which has to be addressed, and that at a bare minimum the case for the dam has to be made by posing rights against rights, and by arguing that the violation of rights in this particular case can lead to some extension of rights for others, or that the dam can be built or will be built in such a way that rights will not be violated. And so it changes the form of the argument which takes place, and I think that that's very important in avoiding some of the more sloppy and dangerous forms of argument that exist and that have been very often influential in the field of development, but more generally in economic and social affairs. Let me let me mention one more such way in which rights discourse can be helpful, very generally, before going into a specific example. One of the prominent trends of the last 20 years in the field of development has been what one might call development philanthropy. People like Bill Gates, Bill and Melinda Gates in their foundation, gigantic foundation, and many others have been deploying very large amounts of resources in the name of economic and social development. And there are quite a number of people who view this as desirable. But I think it's right to have a critical eye on such development philanthropy for a number of reasons. One of them, which has been to some extent understood, though not perhaps widely enough, is that development philanthropy, certainly when it becomes one of the primary means of bringing about development, or claiming to bring about development, very much shapes and perhaps distorts the concerns which are present and the choices which are made. The governing ideas in a particular field come to be structured by the enormous flows of resources which are emanating from certain sources. And to give you one example, in the area, I think, of health, where many of these foundations have been extremely active, there has been a tendency toward one might call a rather technocratic approach to development, which emphasizes particular scientific and technical interventions, which, if only they were universalized, would bring about good outcomes. And of course, an unstated part of the story is that there are profit-making interests oftentimes behind the development and the production and the distribution of those interventions. The idea of doing good and doing well are seamlessly intertwined in this point of view, both on the part of the philanthropists who bring the resources to bear and in terms of the way in which the resources are eventually deployed. I think at least that that's very often the case. the governing conception here is one of charity, it's one of good works, and it's one of people who are ordinary people, deprived and poor people around the world who are deemed to be lucky to be the beneficiaries of philanthropic activity. And you can think about the meaning of the underlying etymology of that term in Greek, the activity which is based on the love of fellow human beings. Now, I think that a rights-based perspective militates against all of this. It tells us, first of all, that people have basic rights, which ought to demand that certain efforts be undertaken on their behalf, whether or not by the philanthropists, whether by the state, whether by fellow citizens, whether by others. It also, I would say, directs us to take a more institutional point of view on why people suffer deprivations in the first place and how those deprivations can be addressed. The technocratic conception that if only a new vaccine will be developed or some new intervention of one kind or another, that will be the solution, and that perhaps a multinational corporation will be the agency through which this technical intervention is developed, produced, and disseminated, is not one which a rights-based perspective would tend to support, precisely because it asks the question, why is the rights failure taking place? Why are rights failing to be fulfilled in the first place? And here I'm in complete sympathy with Professor Wolff's remarks. We have to ask the question of how and why it is that the existing institutions are functioning in such a way as to bring about these failures. Amartya Sen, famously in his book Poverty and Famines, asked us to consider why it is that people starve to death. And some of his friends and his critics referred to Professor Sen as having produced a theory of famines. And I beg to differ. I've never agreed that it was a theory. I would say that rather it's a framework. The crucial distinction is this. A theory generates propositions or hypotheses which could potentially be overturned. And Amartya Sen's framework does not do that, but that does not mean it's not useful. What Amartya Sen suggested in Poverty and Famines was that instead we should ask the question, if someone starves to death, why did that person starve to death? What are the particular reasons that that person starved to death? Was it because of what is called an exchange entitlement failure, which is to say that market prices moved in such a way that the person couldn't sell his or her labor power, which he or she depends on to survive, in order to, in a way that was sufficiently remunerative that person could then command sufficient food in the marketplace to be able to avoid starvation? Or was it that there was a failure of own production entitlements where a smallholder who depended on producing food on his or her plot of land found that this particular harvest, it was not possible because of a calamity of some kind? A flood or another such natural calamity, or perhaps something else? Was it that there was a failure on the part of the state which had guaranteed to provide food to individuals otherwise to do so because of some breakdown? Was it a failure on the part of social networks and systems which were being depended on by the individuals concerned? We know, for instance, from the work that has been done by Sen and his collaborators, that among the people who are most likely to die in famines are widows and orphans, as well as members of certain occupational categories. And there are reasons for this. The widows and orphans very much die because their connections, very often die because their connections to social networks that would support them or would provide them with some type of food security are very weak, tenuous, and very often they're the first, therefore, to be cut loose in some sense, and for whose claims are rejected or are not respected.